My father introduced me, and now it's my son's turn. Woodworking is a passion we'll share forever. Woodcraft understands that. Their people know the right tool for the job, and they make sure we understand how to use it. Their help? It means a lot. Woodcraft knows how we feel because they feel the same way. You know, I enjoy sharing my secrets, and now Jake's teaching me some things too. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Tight Bond Wood Glues, the pro's advantage.
Hello and welcome to another episode of I Can Do That. I'm your host, Chad Stanton, and today's project is this drop front desk. Now, whenever I think of a drop front desk, I think of the one that my grandma had and had kind of that old antique look to it. So we decided to make one that has more of a modern feel. Now, the majority of this is just made out of plywood and pocket screws. Obviously, we have this opened up so we can put a lot of storage in there and even a lower shelf that you could put some books on. Now the sides, well, the sides I have some hardwood. In this case I have maple. And I've added this decorative aluminum dowel pin to it. Also too, I made my own dark ebonizing stain, and we'll show you how to do that recipe. So without further ado, let me move this out of the way, get the tools and material in here, and we'll start building our modern desk. Okay, the majority of this project was built with plywood, and I was able to do it with just one sheet. But that's because I had the front lid and this end panel out of hardwood. And to save a little bit of money, I decided on the second build, I'm going to do it all out of plywood. But that required a second sheet. Anyhow, let me show you some of the layout on this. Now the panels, such as this inside end one, as well as this outside, have that same 10-degree angle to it. And that's what I have laid out here. And you'll notice I'm able to get this out of the piece of plywood, but keep in mind these are going to be mirrored images of each other. What that means is, although this side looks really nice, this is my outside, this just became the inside. So keep in mind when you're selecting your plywood that you don't have too radical of a pattern change. Now I'm not too worried about this because, as I said, that's going to be my inside panel. Now when it comes to cutting these out, I have to make sure that both pieces stay the same size. And what I have to worry about is that saw blade. So you'll notice that I have the measurements here, which are included at the plans at the end of this video. And so I measured over, and I have a little space. What that space mark represents is the thickness of the saw blade. That way, when I cut right down this line, this piece and the other piece will be the same size. Okay, here's how I'm going to make that cut. This is a jig that we've used in the past. And this is for my circular saw. You'll notice that the saw, it rides against this fence, and it's also in line with the edge of the jig, so I can set it right on that line. And I want to set the depth of the blade so that's just going through the plywood material. And underneath it, I have some sacrificial boards so I'm not cutting up my bench top. Okay, let me lay this out and I'll make the cut. Now this is going to leave me a lot of material left to make those shelves, but each one of these shelves has that 10-degree angle to it. So I'm going to show you how to address that issue next. Okay, so I have the two end pieces here clamped together in the vise. And take a look at this. even though I took some measurements and precise cutting with the jig, you'll notice I'm pretty flat at this end, pretty flush. But as I move down to the other end, well, I'm off significantly. Now, you might think that's not a big deal, but over here, it will really come into play. You'll notice that both these end panels, they have to be the same size so that our shelves line up at both ends. It will also come into play when you close the lid. Again, you don't want any gaps for it. So I'm going to finish planing this down so that these are exactly the same. And then I'm going to start working on those shelves. I have to cross-cut it to the exact length and put that 10-degree angle on the front. So I'll show you all that next. Okay, so I've been busy cutting the pieces for the shelves. Now, with the circular saw and my jig, I was able to rip these a little bit wide from our final dimension. But what I need to do now is get them to exact length. So you'll notice that the top piece runs the full width of the unit. But the shelves, well, they're shorter. Our measurement is 22.5, and we need all of these to be exactly the same size, so it goes together nicely. So I have over here on the bench our cross-cutting circular saw jig. Now, we've used this several times in other episodes, but let me show you how it works again. So I've measured over my 22.5 inches, and I made an X on the waist side that I need to cut. Now my jig is clamped down, and then I used another clamp, which will be the measurement from my saw kerf to the end here. This is acting as a stop block. So now when I place this in here, you'll notice that my line lines right up with that kerf. And all I got to do is make the cut. Now I know what you're thinking, Chad, these edges are still square, we don't have that 10-degree bevel on them. Well, I'll show you that next. Okay, so I have all the pieces cut to length, and now I want to make that 10-degree angle on the front of them. Now, there's several ways that you could do this. You could set the bevel at 10 degrees, mark it, and then with a hand plane, you could shave it down to the line. However, I got to tell you, it's probably not going to be the most accurate. The best way to really do it is if you have access to a table saw. You could tilt your blade to 10 degrees and rip all these pieces. Now, another option would be you could use your circular saw, and you could tilt the bottom so it's at 10 degrees and make a long rip cut along that plywood. However, I'm not certain I'm going to get all the pieces lengthwise out of that plywood for this. So the option that we're going to use is the router table. Now, we made this router table a few episodes ago, and this is another opportunity to show you the advantages of having one. So the bit that I have in the router table is this flush cutting bit. So we have the blade, and then we have a bearing that the wood would ride against. In this case, it's probably not going to come into effect, but that bearing helps me set the fence for that bit. The way I want to set it is I want that bearing to either be perfectly flush with the fence, or in this case, I have just a small gap, so it takes a little bit more of an aggressive cut, but not too much. Okay, now you'll notice that I have this scrap piece of wood clamped on the end. This is what's going to help me give that angle, because our bit is straight, but we're shooting for 10 degrees. I set the bevel to 10 degrees, and by placing this on here, right where that bevel comes up, that's the distance I measure to make my scrap piece of wood. Now, of course, make sure you test everything before you do it on your final pieces. But I'm all set up here, and I'm going to show you the passes. And it's going to take several passes. It's not going to do it on one, but it'll do it the most accurate. That looks pretty good. All right, I'm going to finish up the other pieces, and then I'm going to cover the edge of this so I don't have to see the layers of the plywood. I'll show you that next. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover the layers of the plywood here so it looks more like a solid piece of wood. And I'm going to do that with some edge banding. Now, the edge banding is actual wood veneer on one side, and on the other side, it has an adhesive that when heat is applied, it'll melt and glue it together. So, I'll cut some of the edge banding a little bit longer than the actual material that I have to put it to. And then I like to use a small piece of tape to hold it in place. The purpose of this is for two reasons. One, without the tape, well, it wants to kind of curl up on me. The other reason is as this glue starts to melt, it will slide a little. This will keep it from moving too much. And that's also why I have the tabs longer, so it doesn't wind up like that after it dries. Okay, so I have my iron brought up to temperature, and I'm just going to slowly move it across. Now the edge banding is actually wider than the 3/4 inch material, so I'm going to have some trimming to do. Now while that glue is still hot, I like to use a scrap piece of wood and just press down on it to make sure I got good firm application to it. Okay, the first thing now is I'm going to trim these ends off. And again, with my scrap piece of wood, I'll use a razor blade knife from the bottom and break that off. Okay. Now, as I said, this is a little bit wider than the 3/4 inch. And so there's a tool that's used for this. The tool actually has blades in it, and it tells you the direction that you push it. And what you do with this is, on both sides, you have a set of blades. You put this over your piece, you squeeze it together, and then you push it the direction of the arrows. Now, that's fine, but I usually like to separate it and use just one side. Because, see, this is real wood, and just like with wood, the grain goes a certain direction. You want the blade to be going with the grain. So if one blade is going with, that means the other blade is pushing against it. So I'll run it down one side, turn it around, and run it back the other. Now it gets it pretty close, but it's still not perfect because of that 10-degree angle. So at this point, I'll follow up with a file, and then after that, I'll finish it up with some sandpaper. So let me finish this, do the others, and then we'll start doing some assembly. Okay, so I'm going to do some assembly right now. And I'm not going to start with the top shelf. That's actually going to go on last. So I'm starting with that second shelf. And you'll notice it has a divider on it. So the divider was pretty simple. Again, it was just another piece of plywood. I found the center of my board, pre-drilled it, and now I'm just putting a couple of screws through it. You'll notice too that the divider also has that 10 degrees cut to it, so it follows the whole profile of the project. Now I'm going to attach it to the sides here. And again, I already went ahead and pre-drilled my pocket holes in it, so I'm just going to use some pocket screws to hold it in place. Now I will say though that it was important that you cut these pieces just a little bit large, and then if you have to, trim them down. The placement of this first one is important because the shelf has to be perfectly parallel with the top of the side. So it's important that this front edge stays flush, and if it hangs out a little in the back, well, you can just plane it. Okay, so besides checking my measurements from side to side, I also put some pipe clamps underneath it because these pocket holes, they're drilled on an angle, and as I tighten the screw in, well, it has a tendency to want to shift. I'm also going to check with my square to make sure that it's still at 90 degrees. Okay, so now I'm going to take it out of the clamps and stand it up. I'll glue and nail the top shelf on, and then I'm going to take a measurement for what the back will be on this. Okay, so I just finished putting the back in, and I want this to fit rather snug because the back is what's going to help keep this all square. Now I'm just going to glue and nail the top on. Put a couple of clamps on it. And I'll just simply put nails in all 3 spots, and then I'll turn it around and we'll start working on that front lid. Okay, so I'm getting ready to put the front lid on, but let's take a look at this one for a second. One of the things you'll notice is that it's not quite as wide as the actual cabinet. Side to side, the lid is a little bit shorter. And that's because I don't want to have any interference when it opens and closes with these end panels. The other thing is I have some hinges on it. And there are specialty hinges out there, but these are just regular butt hinges I got from the big box store. But because people tend to want to lean on this as a desk, I also picked up these lid hinge supports, and that's going to give it a lot more strength. So let me show you now how I actually position this to get the lid on there. I took a couple of scrap pieces of wood and I clamped them to the side, and I made sure that they're tight with the bottom of that shelf. I did that on both sides. Now I can easily place my lid on here and get it lined up. And again, I want to position it so I have a little bit of space on each side of this. Now I've already attached the hinges to the inside of the cabinet, and I went ahead and pre-drilled for attaching it to the lid. So let me put those screws in right now. Okay, you probably noticed that there's no edge banding on my lid. That's because I want to fine-tune this. So I'm going to close it, and my gaps seem pretty good, but see, I'm tall. So what I'm going to do is with my pencil, I marked it, and now I can cut this on that same 10-degree angle, and that way it'll be flush with the top. Then I can edge band it. I'm also going to take this time right now to attach the lid support and test that before I take it all apart. I've already measured, and I'm just going to attach this and check it out. Okay, that's one. I'll do the other side, and then I'll button it up. Okay, my lid is on, and it's working just fine. For all intensive purposes, you could call this project done as it is. However, if you're going to stop at this point, I would mention that the top ends here, well, they would need some edge banding. But see, I'm not too worried about that because on the next episode, I'm going to show you how to make these decorative end panels. Now, you may think it's not that hard, but there are a couple technical things that you do need to be aware of, and we're going to walk you through every step. And I'm going to give you my special recipe for making this nice dark ebony stain. So we'll see you next time right here on I Can Do That.